The scorching dust of Tombstone's auction yard hung in the still air like a shroud over the damned. Charlotte Rivers stood on the wooden platform, her wrists raw from iron shackles, watching 40 pairs of predatory eyes evaluate her like livestock. The summer of 1887 had been merciless to Arizona Territory, and what remained of this once proud silver mining town was a collection of desperados, gamblers, and broken dreams clinging to a place that no longer deserved its reputation. Charlie's green eyes blazed with defiant fury as auctioneer Jeremiah Pike strutted across the platform in his garish purple suit, his voice carrying the oily polish of a man who'd found profit in human misery. At 22, Charlie had been traveling from Colorado to take a teaching position in Santa Fe when Comanchero raiders struck her wagon train. 6 days of hell had followed 6 days chained like an animal, while her captors murdered her fellow travelers and spoke of the fortunes they'd make selling her. "A gentleman," Pike called out, spreading his arms wide. "Today we have something special, an educated woman fresh from Colorado, perfect for domestic service or other arrangements." The crowd pressed closer, their leering faces a gallery of frontier scum. Charlie recognized the types: ranch foremen seeking unpaid labor, saloon owners wanting fresh attractions, wealthy Mexican landowners whose haciendas always needed servants, who couldn't complain to authorities. But when Pike ordered her to turn around for inspection, Charlie's spine stiffened. "I am not cattle to be inspected," she declared, her voice carrying across the entire yard. "I'm a human being, and I will not be treated otherwise." The crowd erupted in a mixture of laughter and catcalls. Some seemed amused by her spirit, others offended by her defiance. But Silas Crenshaw took her words as a personal insult, demanding immediate correction. The drunken outlaw leader pushed through the crowd toward the platform, his unwashed bulk radiating the stench of whiskey and cruelty. Crenshaw commanded a gang of 12 men who specialized in robbing isolated ranches. But lately their luck had been poor, and their funds even worse. "You hear that, boys?" Crenshaw shouted, climbing unsteadily to his feet. "The little princess thinks she's too good for us common folk. Maybe someone should teach her different." Charlie met his bloodshot gaze without flinching. She'd grown up with 3 older brothers who taught her that bullies only respected strength. $20 won't buy you anything from me except the pleasure of hearing me tell you exactly what kind of man you really are." The crowd fell silent. Even Pike seemed stunned by Charlie's audacity. In the brutal hierarchy of frontier justice, defying an armed outlaw in front of witnesses was tantamount to suicide. Crenshaw's face turned purple with rage. He lurched up the platform steps, his movements clumsy but determined. "You need to learn some respect, little girl." His hand came up fast and hard. The sound of his palm striking Charlie's cheek echoed across the auction yard like a gunshot. The blow was vicious enough to snap her head to the side and bring tears to her eyes, blood trickling from her split lip. But Charlie didn't fall. She turned back to face her attacker, her green eyes blazing with fury rather than fear. "Is that the best you can do?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. For a moment, nobody moved. Crenshaw raised his hand to strike again, this time with enough force to knock her unconscious. That's when Steelhawk stepped out of the crowd. From the ridge overlooking Tombstone, the Apache warrior had been watching the town's morning ritual unfold, with the patient intensity of a predator studying prey. Steelhawk had been tracking the Comanchero raiders, who'd been terrorizing settlements along the border for 3 months, following a trail of blood and broken families that led inevitably to places like Pike's auction yard. At 30, Steelhawk was a man caught between 2 worlds, equally at home, in both yet fully accepted by neither. Born Koshi to the Chiricahua Apache, he'd been raised in traditional ways until cavalry raids scattered his band when he was barely 16. Taken in by Mexican rancher Miguel Herrera, he'd learned Spanish and English to read and write to understand the complex web of laws and customs governing the white man's world. But understanding didn't mean accepting. Steelhawk had seen too much of what civilization brought to the frontier, the casual cruelty, the assumption that might made right the way powerful men used law and order as weapons against the weak. He'd chosen his own path, becoming a tracker and scout who worked for those who couldn't afford justice through official channels. His appearance was striking in a way that made most men uncomfortable. Tall and lean, with the kind of muscular build that came from years of hard living in harsh country, Steelhawk moved with fluid grace, equally comfortable on foot or horseback. His black hair hung to his shoulders, braided with leather, and small bones that clicked softly when he moved. His obsidian eyes missed nothing. He wore a mixture of Apache and Mexican clothing, buckskin leggings and moccasins, a white cotton shirt beneath a black leather vest, and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded his angular features. 2 Colt .45s rode low on his hips, but it was the large knife on his left side that most people noticed first. The blade had been forged by his grandfather from metal taken from fallen cavalry sabers, and it had tasted the blood of more than a dozen men who'd mistaken Steelhawk's silence for weakness. Now, as he studied the crowd gathering in Pike's auction yard through field glasses taken from a dead army officer, Steelhawk felt the familiar cold fury that preceded violence. He'd tracked the Comanchero raiders this far, following reports of kidnapped women and children sold into slavery. Today's auction would determine whether his hunt ended in justice or massacre. 12 years ago, Comanchero raiders had taken his sister Ayana from their winter camp. Steelhawk had tracked them for 3 months through country that would have killed lesser men, following a cold trail across 2 territories and into Mexico. When he'd finally found the slave market in Chihuahua, where she'd been sold, Ayana was already dead. Worked to death in a Mexican Don's silver mines, treated as expendable labor to be used up and replaced. Steelhawk had killed the Don and 17 of his men in a single night of bloody vengeance. But it hadn't brought Ayana back. Nothing would bring her back, but he could prevent other sisters from sharing her fate. The crowd parted like water before a shark as Steelhawk moved through the auction yard with predatory grace. His moccasins made no sound on the packed earth, but every man instinctively stepped aside as something primal in their hindbrain recognized the approach of an apex predator. The Apache warrior's dark eyes never left Silas Crenshaw's face as he glided toward the platform with the fluid motion of smoke given human form. Steelhawk had been watching from the shadows since dawn, positioned behind an old water trough, where the angle gave him clear sight lines to every corner of Pike's operation. "Step away from the woman," Steelhawk said quietly, his voice carrying despite its low volume. The words were spoken in perfect English, but with an undertone that suggested speaking at all was a courtesy he rarely extended to white men. Crenshaw's whiskey-soaked brain took several seconds to process this development. An Indian, a damned Apache by the look of him, was giving orders to a white man in front of witnesses. The racial hierarchy of the frontier demanded a response that would reassert proper dominance, regardless of how dangerous this particular Indian appeared to be. "You got some stones, Injun." Crenshaw slurred, trying to inject authority into his voice, despite the tremor that betrayed his growing fear. "But you're forgetting your place. This here's white man's business, and you'd best get back to whatever reservation you crawled off of before someone teaches you proper manners." Steelhawk's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the quality of his stillness. Where before he'd seemed merely dangerous, now he radiated the focused intensity of a diamondback coiled to strike. The crowd sensed the change and began edging backward, creating more space around the platform where violence was about to unfold. Charlie Rivers watched this exchange with fascination rather than fear. Her cheek still burned from Crenshaw's blow, and she could taste blood from her split lip. But the arrival of this silent warrior had fundamentally altered the dynamics of her situation. She didn't know if he intended to help her or simply eliminate a competitor for her purchase. But either way, he represented change in circumstances that had seemed hopeless. "I'll give you one more chance," Steelhawk said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Step away from the woman. Mount your horse and ride out of town. Do this now, and you might live to see another sunset." The crowd stirred uneasily at these words. In the brutal mathematics of frontier justice, threatening a white man, especially in front of witnesses, was a capital offense for any Indian. But there was something about Steelhawk's calm certainty that suggested he wasn't making empty threats. Crenshaw's gang began moving through the crowd, hands drifting toward gun butts as they prepared to support their leader. Dutch Martinez positioned himself near the platform's left side, while two other outlaws flanked right. The remaining gang members spread out to create crossfire lanes, their movements coordinated with the precision of men who'd fought together many times. But Pike's regular customers were caught in the middle of what was rapidly escalating into a shooting war. The auction crowd began melting away toward the exits as survival instincts overcame curiosity. Within moments, the yard had cleared, except for Crenshaw's gang Pike's hired muscle, and a handful of spectators, too drunk or stupid to recognize mortal danger. "You think I'm afraid of one half-breed Apache?" Crenshaw shouted, drawing confidence from his numerical advantage. "Boys show this red devil what happens when his kind gets uppity with white folks." Steelhawk smiled for the first time since entering the auction yard. It wasn't a pleasant expression, more like a wolf baring its fangs before attacking. His hands remained at his sides, but Charlie noticed his weight had shifted to the balls of his feet in preparation for explosive movement. What happened next would be talked about in Tombstone saloons for decades, growing into legend with each retelling, until truth became indistinguishable from myth. Steelhawk moved with speed that seemed to bend the laws of physics, his hands flowing to his guns in a draw so smooth it appeared choreographed. The first shot took Dutch Martinez between the eyes before the outlaw could clear leather. The second and third shots fired so close together they sounded like one dropped the two flanking gunmen with rounds through their hearts. Steelhawk was already moving as he fired, rolling left behind a water barrel as return fire began chewing splinters from the platform. Crenshaw had thrown himself flat at the first gunshot, his whiskey-dulled reflexes finally serving him well. From his prone position, he had a clear view of Steelhawk's impossible display of marksmanship and tactical awareness. The Apache warrior seemed to anticipate where each opponent would be before they got there, placing his shots with surgical precision, while avoiding the desperate return fire of increasingly panicked outlaws. He moved through the auction yard like a ghost, using cover and concealment to separate his enemies and defeat them individually. The fourth outlaw tried to circle behind the platform and walked into Steelhawk's knife. The blade took him under the ribs, angled upward into his heart, dropping him without a sound. The fifth and sixth men rattled by, watching their companions die with such casual efficiency, broke and ran for their horses. Steelhawk let them go, recognizing they no longer posed a threat. Pike's hired muscle, three hard cases who'd been paid to maintain order at the auction, found themselves in a situation far beyond their pay grade. They'd signed on to intimidate unruly bidders and prevent escapes, not face down a one-man Apache war party. When Steelhawk's cold gaze swept over them, all three simultaneously decided they had urgent business elsewhere. Within 90 seconds of the first shot, 7 men were dead or dying, and the auction yard belonged entirely to Steelhawk. The Apache warrior reloaded his guns with practiced efficiency, his movements calm and unhurried, despite the carnage surrounding him. Gun smoke drifted across the platform like incense in some deadly cathedral. Charlie had dropped to the platform's wooden planks the moment shooting started, but she couldn't resist watching the deadly ballet unfolding below. Steelhawk fought like no man she'd ever seen, combining the fluid grace of his Apache heritage with gunfighting skills that would have impressed Wild Bill Hickok himself. Crenshaw slowly pushed himself to his knees, his hands raised in surrender, his face pale with shock and terror. The outlaw leader who'd strutted around the auction yard like a conquering hero was now reduced to begging for his life from a man he dismissed as racially inferior just minutes before. "Please." Crenshaw whimpered, his earlier arrogance completely evaporated. "I got money gold hidden away. You can have it all. Just let me live." I got a family back in Missouri. Kids who need their daddy. Steelhawk stopped directly in front of the platform, close enough that Crenshaw could see his own reflection in the Apache's obsidian eyes. When Steelhawk spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute judgment. You struck a woman who could not defend herself. In my culture, such men are considered less than animals. Animals at least kill for food or to protect their young. You struck her to feed your own weakness. Charlie found herself studying Steelhawk's profile as he spoke, noting the strong line of his jaw and the way his long black hair caught the afternoon sunlight. There was something almost ritualistic about his stillness, as if he were performing a ceremony that required perfect precision. Among the Apache, Steelhawk continued, there are traditions for dealing with men who abuse women and children. These traditions are very old, passed down from our grandfathers' grandfathers. They exist because some lessons can only be learned through pain. Crenshaw's eyes widened with dawning horror as he realized Steelhawk wasn't interested in negotiating terms of surrender. This wasn't about money or territory or even personal revenge. This was about justice, according to laws far older than any territorial court. Steelhawk drew his knife, the same blade that had opened the throat of the man who'd killed his sister Ayanna. The weapon seemed to absorb sunlight along its keen edge, and Crenshaw could see his own terrified face reflected in the polished steel. Wait, Charlie called out from the platform, surprising herself by speaking. What's your name? Steelhawk turned to look at her, his knife still pointed at Crenshaw's throat. For a moment their eyes met, and Charlie felt something pass between them. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding. When he spoke, his voice held a different quality, warmer somehow. I'm called Steelhawk among the whites. My Apache name is not for their tongues. Charlie nodded slowly. Steelhawk, this man deserves to die for what he's done. But killing him won't change anything. There will always be another man like him and another after that. Maybe there's a different kind of justice. Steelhawk studied her face, noting the intelligence in her green eyes and the strength that had allowed her to maintain dignity even in chains. Here was a woman who understood that true strength sometimes meant choosing mercy when vengeance would be easier. What would you have me do with him? Charlie looked down at Crenshaw, who knelt trembling in his own filth, stripped of all pretense and reduced to his essential cowardice. An idea began forming in her mind, shaped by years of teaching children who'd never learned the difference between right and wrong. Strip him, Charlie said quietly, her voice carrying across the now silent auction yard. Take his guns, his money, his boots. Leave him with nothing but his shame and the long walk back to whatever hole he crawled out of. Steelhawk considered this for a long moment, his knife still pressed against Crenshaw's throat. The Apache way would be swift execution, an ending that balanced the scales of justice with blood. But this red-haired woman spoke of a different kind of justice, one that left the guilty alive to carry the weight of their humiliation. You would show mercy to a man who showed you none. Charlie shook her head. Not mercy. Education. Let him walk back to his gang naked and beaten, carrying the story of how one Apache warrior destroyed 12 men without breaking a sweat. Let every outlaw from here to the Rio Grande know that Steelhawk is hunting them and that their lives depend on how they treat the innocent. The wisdom of this approach struck Steelhawk immediately. A dead outlaw was just another corpse in a territory already littered with them. But a living example of defeat, stripped of dignity and weapons, would spread fear more effectively than any number of graves. Steelhawk stepped back and sheathed his knife, but his eyes never left Crenshaw's face. You heard the lady. Remove your clothes. All of them. As Crenshaw stumbled naked into the desert heat, Steelhawk turned his attention to the more pressing matter of what to do with Charlotte Rivers, the woman who'd shown such courage in the face of brutality, who'd chosen mercy when vengeance would have been justified, represented something Steelhawk had thought lost in this harsh land, the possibility that civilization might actually mean more than simply the strong preying upon the weak. You are free to go, Charlotte Rivers. Steelhawk said, approaching the platform where Charlie still sat, her wrists raw from the iron shackles that had held her for 6 days of hell. "Free to go where?" Charlie asked, climbing carefully to her feet. Her legs trembled from exhaustion and the aftermath of terror, but her voice remained steady. "I have no money, no horse, no supplies. My traveling companions are dead. My belongings burned with the wagons. Freedom without means is just another kind of prison." Steelhawk studied her face, noting the practical intelligence behind her question. This woman understood that rescue without resources was merely a different form of captivity. She wasn't weeping with gratitude or throwing herself at his feet in feminine helplessness. Instead, she was calculating her options with the cool logic of someone accustomed to solving her own problems. "The outlaw's horse and gear belong to you now," Steelhawk said, nodding toward Crenshaw's mount, a sturdy bay mare with good lines and better training. "His money too, by right of conquest. There's enough gold there to buy passage to wherever you were heading." Charlie looked at the horse and then back at Steelhawk. Something in his manner suggested this conversation was more complex than a simple transfer of property. He was testing her somehow, waiting to see how she'd respond to unexpected freedom. "And what about you?" she asked. "Do you always ride into town, kill half a dozen outlaws, and then disappear back into the desert like some kind of avenging spirit?" For the first time since she'd seen him, Steelhawk's expression shifted toward something that might have been amusement. "Usually, yes. But today feels different." Charlie stepped down from the platform, moving carefully to avoid the pools of blood that marked where Crenshaw's men had fallen. The auction yard looked like a battlefield now littered with bodies and abandoned weapons. Soon the authorities would arrive to investigate the shooting, and questions would be asked that neither she nor Steelhawk wanted to answer. "There's something you should know," Steelhawk said, pulling a worn leather portfolio from his saddlebags. Inside were wanted posters, dozens of them featuring the faces of men involved in the slave trade that stretched from Colorado to Mexico. "I didn't come to Tombstone to rescue you specifically. I came hunting the men who sold you." Charlie examined the posters, recognizing several faces from her nightmare journey. Joaquin Vargas' scarred visage stared back at her from a Dodger offering $500 for his capture, dead or alive. Other faces belonged to the Comanchero raiders who destroyed her wagon train and murdered her fellow travelers. "You're a bounty hunter," Charlie said, understanding, flooding her voice. "This wasn't about justice for me. This was about the reward money." Steelhawk shook his head slowly. "The money matters, but not in the way you think. Every dollar I collect from these bounties goes to buy supplies for Apache families hiding in the mountains or to purchase the freedom of children sold into slavery. Justice and profit can serve the same cause when the cause is righteous." Charlie studied the wanted posters more carefully, noting the crimes listed beneath each photograph. Murder, kidnapping, slave trading, rape. These men represented the absolute worst of frontier lawlessness. If Steelhawk was hunting them, he was doing work that territorial marshals either couldn't or wouldn't handle. "The Comancheros who took me," Charlie said, "they're part of a larger organization. They talked about other raids, other auctions. There are more victims out there, more families destroyed." "Which is why I'm offering you a choice," Steelhawk said. "Take Crenshaw's horse and money, ride to the nearest town with a sheriff, and try to rebuild your life. Or ride with me and help me find the rest of them." The proposition hit Charlie like a physical blow. She'd spent 6 days dreaming of escape, of returning to some semblance of normal life. The idea of deliberately placing herself in more danger of tracking down the very men who terrorized her seemed like madness. But as she looked at the wanted posters, Charlie saw the faces of other victims, women and children, whose suffering would continue as long as these predators remained free. She thought of Timothy and Sarah Mullins, the orphaned children sold at this very auction to a cattle baron, whose reputation suggested their fate would be worse than death. "Why me?" Charlie asked. "You could track them alone. You've obviously done this kind of work before. Steelhawk was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying some distant point beyond the auction yard. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of old pain, because you know their faces, their voices, their methods. Because you've seen how they operate and survived to tell about it. And because sometimes the hunter needs someone who remembers what it feels like to be prey. Charlie understood now why Steelhawk moved through the world with such deadly certainty. He wasn't just a bounty hunter or even an avenging angel. He was a man who'd found meaning in preventing others from experiencing the loss that had nearly destroyed him. If I ride with you, Charlie said slowly, I won't be a burden. I can shoot, I can ride, and I can take care of myself. But I have conditions. Steelhawk raised an eyebrow, intrigued by her boldness. Name them. First, we save whoever we can, not just collect bounties. Second, you teach me everything you know about tracking and fighting. And third, when this is over, when we've broken up this slave ring, you help me get those children back. Which children? Timothy and Sarah Mullins. The ones sold here today. I won't abandon them to whatever hell that cattle baron has planned. Steelhawk studied Charlie's face, seeing determination that matched his own. Here was a woman who'd looked into the abyss and decided to stare back. Most people who'd survived what she'd endured would spend the rest of their lives hiding from shadows. Charlie Rivers was proposing to hunt the monsters who cast them, or mount up. Steelhawk said, swinging into his own saddle with fluid grace. We have a trail to follow while it's still warm. 3 days of hard riding through increasingly treacherous terrain brought Steelhawk and Charlie to a narrow canyon where red sandstone walls towered above a small stream. Through his field glasses, Steelhawk studied the Comanchero camp with the calculating eye of a predator evaluating prey. 5 men. Steelhawk whispered, handing Charlie the glasses. 3 we tracked from Tombstone, plus 2 who were waiting here. See the one with the silver conchos on his vest? That's Miguel Santos Vargas' second in command. Charlie focused the glasses on Santos, memorizing his face and the way he moved around the camp with casual authority. The man was smaller than she'd expected from his reputation, but there was something in his posture that suggested coiled violence ready to spring. During their journey, Steelhawk had begun Charlie's education in the deadly arts of tracking and survival. He'd shown her how to read sign in sand and stone, how to move silently across different types of terrain, how to approach an enemy camp without alerting sentries. Charlie absorbed every lesson with the intensity of someone whose life depended on the knowledge. 2 of them were with the raiding party that took you. Steelhawk continued. Carlos Mendez and the one they call El Lobo. Charlie felt her jaw clench as she recognized El Lobo's scarred face. He was the one who'd killed Mrs. Patterson, the minister's wife, from their wagon train when she'd tried to protect the Mullins children. Charlie had watched him laugh as the woman dyed her blood, soaking into the desert sand, while her husband wept over her body. I want him, Charlie said quietly. Revenge is a luxury we can't afford. Steelhawk replied firmly. These men are professionals. The moment we let emotion cloud our judgment, we're dead. Justice, yes. Vengeance, no. As the sun sank toward the western mountains, Steelhawk and Charlie withdrew to plan their approach. The Comancheros would post guards after dark, making a direct assault suicidal even for someone with Steelhawk's skills. Santos is careful but predictable. Steelhawk explained, sketching the camp layout in the sand with a piece of charcoal. He'll set 2 guards on 4-hour shifts, 1 at each end of the canyon. The others will sleep close to the fire weapons within reach, but not necessarily loaded. Charlie studied the makeshift map, noting the positions of cover and concealment, the likely fields of fire, the escape routes that enemies might use. Her father's cavalry training was proving more valuable than any finishing school education. How do we get past the guards without raising an alarm? We don't get past them, Steelhawk said with a smile that held no warmth. We go through them. Steelhawk moved through the pre-dawn darkness, silent, as a shadow his moccasined feet finding purchase on stone ledges that would have challenged a mountain goat. Charlie followed 20 feet behind, amazed by her own ability to navigate terrain that would have been impossible for her just days earlier. Fear and necessity had awakened capabilities she'd never known she possessed. The eastern guard was positioned behind a fallen boulder that commanded a view of the canyon's main entrance. He was young, maybe 19, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested this was his first time standing watch in hostile territory. His rifle lay across his knees while he rolled cigarettes with shaking hands. Steelhawk studied the guard's routine for 15 minutes, noting the pattern of his movements, the way he glanced toward the campfire every few minutes, as if seeking reassurance from his sleeping comrades. When the moment came, Steelhawk moved with the swift silence of a hunting cat. The guard never knew what hit him. Steelhawk's knife took him under the ribs at an angle that pierced his heart, killing him instantly and silently. The Western guard proved more challenging. He was older, more experienced, and positioned in a spot that offered no concealment for approach. Steelhawk studied the situation for long minutes before turning to Charlie with a plan that made her blood freeze. "I need you to create a distraction," he said quietly. "Something that will draw him away from his position long enough for me to get close." "What kind of distraction?" "Walk into his line of sight. Let him see you, then run toward the south wall as if you're trying to escape. He'll follow thinking you're a prisoner who got loose from another camp." Charlie stared at Steelhawk in disbelief. "You want me to make myself a target?" "For maybe 30 seconds. I'll be moving the moment he leaves his position. By the time he realizes it's a trap, it'll be over." Every instinct Charlie possessed screamed against deliberately exposing herself to an armed enemy, but she could see the logic in Steelhawk's plan. It was their best chance of eliminating the threat without alerting the main camp. "If something goes wrong, it won't," Steelhawk said with absolute certainty. "Trust me." Charlie took a deep breath and began picking her way down the canyon wall toward the guard's position. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she deliberately stepped on loose stones that clattered into the darkness below. The sound carried clearly in the still air. "Who's there?" the guard called out, rising to his feet with his rifle ready. Charlie stepped into a patch of moonlight, letting him see her clearly. For a moment, their eyes met across 50 yards of broken ground. Then Charlie turned and ran toward the south wall as if her life depended on it. The guard took the bait, abandoning his position to pursue what appeared to be an escaping prisoner. He moved quickly but quietly, not wanting to wake his sleeping comrades until he could determine what he was dealing with. The pursuit carried him away from his post and into Steelhawk's waiting embrace. With both guards eliminated, Steelhawk and Charlie approached the sleeping camp with the caution of hunters stalking dangerous prey. The Comancheros had arranged their bedrolls in a defensive circle around the fire weapons close at hand, but not immediately ready. It was a formation that spoke to experience and paranoia in equal measure. Steelhawk signaled for Charlie to position herself behind a large boulder that offered both cover and a clear field of fire toward the camp. Her hands shook slightly as she checked the loads in Crenshaw's pistol, but her breathing remained steady and controlled. Whatever happened in the next few minutes, she was determined to acquit herself with honor. Santos slept closest to the fire, his silver conchoed vest folded neatly beside his saddle. Even in sleep, one hand rested on the butt of his revolver, while the other clutched a leather portfolio that undoubtedly contained dangerous documents Steelhawk had mentioned. El Lobo lay wrapped in a Mexican sirop, his scarred face visible in the firelight. Charlie studied her enemy's sleeping features, remembering Mrs. Patterson's final moments, and feeling cold fury settle in her chest. This man had murdered an innocent woman without hesitation or remorse. Whatever happened to him tonight would be justice long overdue. Steelhawk moved like a ghost among the sleeping men, his knife gleaming dully in the firelight. The first Comanchero died without waking Steelhawk's blade, taking him through the heart with surgical precision. The second stirred slightly as steel parted flesh, but death claimed him before he could cry out. Carlos Mendez woke as Steelhawk reached for his throat. The outlaw's hand flew to his gun, but Charlie's shot took him through the shoulder before he could clear leather. The sound of gunfire shattered the desert silence like breaking glass. Santos rolled away from the fire as bullets began flying his own guns, appearing in his hands with practice speed. El Lobo came awake, snarling his rifle, sweeping toward Charlie's position as muzzle flashes lit the canyon walls like lightning. The gunfight that followed was brief, but Savage fought at close quarters in dancing firelight that turned shadows into enemies and allies into targets. Charlie found herself caught up in violence that moved too fast for conscious thought, operating on instinct and training that seemed to come from some deeper part of herself. Santos proved to be everything his reputation suggested: fast, accurate, and utterly ruthless. His shots forced Steelhawk to keep moving, never allowing the Apache warrior to establish a stable firing position. But Santos made the mistake of focusing entirely on Steelhawk, forgetting about the woman who'd started the fight. Charlie's second shot took Santos through the chest, the heavy bullet spinning him around and sending him crashing into the fire pit. His vest caught flame immediately, the silver conchos reflecting dancing light as he writhed in agony. But even dying, Santos managed to throw the leather portfolio into the fire before Charlie could stop him. El Lobo had taken refuge behind the horse corral, using the terrified animals as living shields while he tried to pick off his attackers. His rifle cracked repeatedly, sending bullets whining off stone and raising sparks from the canyon walls. But his position limited his field of fire and gave Steelhawk the opening he needed. The Apache warrior circled wide, using the darkness beyond the fire's reach to approach El Lobo's position from an unexpected angle. When Steelhawk finally moved, it was with the sudden violence of a striking rattlesnake. His knife took El Lobo from behind the blade, sliding between ribs to find the outlaw's heart. The last Comanchero threw down his weapons, raised his hands in surrender, his nerve finally breaking under the intensity of the assault. But Steelhawk showed no mercy to men who'd shown none to their victims. The knife that had killed El Lobo found another target, and the canyon fell silent except for the crackling of flames and the nervous nickering of horses. Charlie stood in the aftermath smoke, stinging her eyes, and the acrid smell of burned gunpowder filling her nostrils. Around her lay the bodies of 5 hardened killer's men who'd terrorized the frontier for years until they'd finally met someone deadlier than themselves. But victory came with a terrible cost. The documents, Charlie said, staring at the smoldering remains of Santos's portfolio. All that information is gone. Steelhawk knelt by the fire pit, stirring the ashes with a charred stick. Here and there, fragments of paper had survived the flames, but not enough to read or identify. Maybe that's for the best, Steelhawk said quietly. Dead men tell no tales, and burned papers reveal no secrets. Whatever contacts they had are safe, at least for now. But Charlie knew this victory was just one battle in a longer war. Somewhere in the distance, other victims remained in captivity, awaiting rescue that might never come. "This isn't over," she said, understanding finally that tonight's battle was just one skirmish in a larger conflict. "No." Steelhawk agreed methodically, searching the bodies for intelligence that might lead them to other camps. "This is just the beginning. Varga still has his stronghold in the Dragoons, and there are other operations across the territory. But tonight, we've sent a message that will echo from here to Mexico City." 3 days of hard riding through increasingly treacherous terrain brought Steelhawk and Charlie to the foothills of the Dragoon Mountains, where ancient volcanic forces had carved a landscape of towering spires and hidden valleys perfect for those who lived outside the law. The air grew thin and cold as they climbed their horses, picking careful paths between loose shale and jagged outcroppings that could cripple man or beast with a single misstep. Joaquin Varga's stronghold occupied a natural amphitheater, carved into the mountain's heart, accessible only through a narrow canyon that twisted like a snake's backbone between walls of red stone. From their observation point on, a distant ridge, Steelhawk and Charlie studied the fortress through field glasses, mapping defenses that had been refined through years of paranoid preparation. The main compound consisted of adobe buildings arranged around a central courtyard and their flat roofs providing perfect platforms for sentries and sharpshooters. Corrals for horses occupied the valley's eastern end, while a series of caves carved into the cliff face served as storage for supplies and prisoners. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, suggesting a permanent population of at least 30 men. "It's bigger than I expected," Charlie murmured, counting guard positions and noting the strategic placement of supply caches. "How many people has he got in there?" Steelhawk adjusted his field glasses, studying movement patterns in the compound below. 42 fighting men, plus maybe a dozen support staff cooks, blacksmiths, horse handlers. But it's not the numbers that make this place dangerous. It's the terrain. Charlie followed his gaze to the narrow canyon that provided the only approach to the fortress. The passage was barely wide enough for 2 horses abreast, with towering walls on both sides that would funnel any attacking force into a killing field. A handful of determined defenders could hold that canyon against an army. "Now those caves worry me more." Steelhawk continued, pointing to dark openings scattered across the cliff face. "That's where Varga keeps his prisoners between sails. If we assault the main compound, he might decide to eliminate the evidence rather than risk their testimony." Charlie felt ice form in her stomach as she understood the implications. Somewhere in those caves were women and children who'd suffered the same fate she'd barely escaped. Timothy and Sarah Mullins might be among them, along with dozens of other innocents, whose only crime had been traveling through country controlled by predators. "We need to get them out first," she said, lowering her glasses to meet Steelhawk's obsidian stare. "Whatever we do to Varga, we can't let him hurt those people." Steelhawk nodded grimly. "Which means we can't assault this place like a conventional military target. We need to be surgeons, not soldiers, precise, quiet, deadly." As afternoon shadows lengthened across the mountain landscape, Steelhawk and Charlie withdrew to a sheltered overhang, where they could plan their approach without being observed from the valley below. The Apache warrior spread his knowledge of the fortress, like a map drawing on intelligence gathered during his months inside Varga's organization. The prisoner caves are connected by a series of natural tunnels that run through the cliff face. Steelhawk explained, sketching the layout in sandy soil with a piece of charcoal. "I helped excavate some of those passages when I was working for Varga. There's a back entrance through a chimney formation on the mountain's north face." Charlie studied the crude map, noting the distances involved and the technical challenges of navigating unknown passages in darkness. "How do we get inside without alerting the guards?" "The same way Apache warriors have moved unseen through enemy territory for centuries. Patience, preparation, and absolute silence. We'll wait until the moon sets approach from the blind side of the mountain and be inside the caves before dawn." The plan that emerged over the next hour was audacious in its complexity and desperate in its necessity. Steelhawk would enter through the hidden passage and locate the prisoners, while Charlie created a diversion in the main compound to draw attention away from the caves. Once the captives were free, both would converge on Varga's headquarters for a final confrontation. "What kind of diversion?" Charlie asked, already knowing she wouldn't like the answer. "You're going to walk into the compound and surrender." Charlie stared at Steelhawk as if he'd suggested she jump off the cliff. "Have you lost your mind?" "They'll kill me the moment they recognize me." "I know they won't," Steelhawk said with absolute certainty. "You're worth too much money to kill quickly. Varga will want to interrogate you personally, find out how you escaped and who helped you. That conversation will buy me the time I need to free the prisoners." The logic was sound, but terrifying. Charlie would be walking back into the nightmare she'd fought so hard to escape, trusting her life to timing and a man she'd known for less than a week. Every instinct screamed against such madness. There has to be another way. "If there was, I'd take it." Steelhawk replied, his voice gentle but implacable. But we're 2 people against 40, and we're fighting on their ground. We need every advantage we can create, even if that means using yourself as bait." Charlie looked out over the fortress, imagining herself walking through those gates and facing Joaquin Varga again, and the man who'd ordered her capture, who'd sold her like livestock, who'd laughed when she begged for the lives of her fellow travelers. Fear and rage warred in her chest, but underneath both lay something stronger: determination forged in the fires of injustice. "All right," she said finally. "But if this gets me killed, I'm going to haunt you for the rest of your life." Steelhawk's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. Fair enough. The moon had set behind western peaks when Steelhawk began his climb down the mountain's north face, moving through absolute darkness with the sure-footed grace of a man born to such terrain. Charlie watched until he disappeared into the shadows, then began her own journey toward the fortress gates and whatever fate awaited her there. The approach to Varga's stronghold took her through a maze of boulders and thorny vegetation that tore at her clothes and left bloody scratches on her exposed skin. But Charlie welcomed the physical discomfort. It kept her mind focused on immediate challenges rather than dwelling on the horrors that might lie ahead. As she drew closer to the compound, Charlie could hear voices drifting through the thin mountain air. Men laughing around campfires, horses nickering in their corrals, the occasional bark of orders from sentries making their rounds. It sounded almost normal, like any other frontier settlement, which somehow made it more disturbing than obvious displays of evil. The main gate was a massive timber construction reinforced with iron bands and secured by a bar that would require 3 men to lift. Guard towers flanked the entrance, their occupants silhouetted against the star-filled sky. Charlie knew those men could put bullets through her heart before she got within 50 yards of the gate, but Steelhawk had taught her that sometimes the boldest approach was the safest one. Instead of trying to sneak past the guards, Charlie walked directly toward the gate with her hands raised in clear view. Her voice carried across the compound as she called out in Spanish, "My name is Charlotte Rivers. I want to speak with Joaquin Varga." The effect was electric. Shouts erupted from the guard towers as men scrambled to train their weapons on this unexpected arrival. Within minutes, torch-bearing figures were streaming out of the compound to surround Charlie with a bristling forest of rifle barrels. "Ante Madre de Dios," breathed one of the guards, a grizzled veteran whose scarred face spoke of many battles. "It's the school teacher, the one who escaped from Tombstone." Word spread through the compound like wildfire as more men emerged to stare at the woman who'd walked out of legend and into their midst. Charlie Rivers, the prisoner who'd defied Silas Crenshaw, who'd somehow slipped away from certain slavery, who'd become a ghost story told around campfires. Joaquin Varga himself appeared in the gateway flanked by bodyguards, whose hands never strayed far from their weapons. The Comanchero leader was smaller than Charlie had expected, but he radiated the kind of controlled violence that made size irrelevant. His cold eyes studied her with the calculating gaze of a man evaluating valuable merchandise. "Well, well," Vargas said in accented English, his voice smooth as silk wrapped around a razor blade. "The famous Charlotte Rivers walking into my stronghold like the angel of death herself. Tell me, chica, how does it feel to come home?" Varga's headquarters occupied the compound's most defensible position, a 2-story adobe structure with thick walls and narrow windows that commanded views of every approach. The interior had been furnished with luxuries stolen from a dozen different sources. Persian rugs, European furniture, silver candlesticks that probably belonged to murdered families. Charlie found herself seated across from Varga in a room that felt more like a gentleman's study than an outlaw's lair. The Comanchero leader poured himself a glass of expensive brandy, while his bodyguards took positions near the doors and windows. Despite their casual postures, Charlie noted that each man could draw his weapon and fire in less than 2 seconds. "You've caused me considerable trouble, Señorita Rivers," Varga said, settling into a leather chair that had probably graced some wealthy rancher's parlor before its owner met an unfortunate end. "My men speak of an Apache warrior who appeared like smoke to rescue you. They say he killed 7 good fighters without taking a scratch. 8. Charlie corrected, meeting Varga's stare without flinching. He killed 8 of your men in Tombstone, then tracked down 5 more in the desert. Your organization is bleeding fighters faster than you can replace them. Varga's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. Ah, you know about Santos and his patrol. I wondered what had happened to them. This Apache friend of yours is quite resourceful. Charlie forced herself to remain calm despite the implications of Varga's words. If he knew about the canyon fight, he might also know that she and Steelhawk had been working together. The wrong answer could doom them both. I don't know what you're talking about. After the Apache rescued me in Tombstone, I went north toward Colorado. I've been living with a ranch family near Denver, trying to rebuild my life. Then what brings you back to my mountains, Chica? Surely not nostalgia for our hospitality. Charlie had prepared for this question during her long walk to the compound, crafting a story that might explain her presence while concealing her true purpose. I came back for the children, Timothy and Sarah Mullins. They were sold at the same auction where you had me taken. I want to buy them back. Varga raised an eyebrow, genuinely surprised by this development. You walked into my stronghold, surrounded yourself with my guns, sought to negotiate for 2 orphaned children you barely knew. That seems remarkably foolish, even for a sentimental woman. I have money. Charlie said, producing a leather pouch filled with gold coins taken from dead outlaws. $500 in gold, enough to make it worth your while. The Comanchero leader studied the gold with professional interest, noting the weight and quality of the coins. It was a substantial sum, more than many frontier families saw in a year. But Charlie could see calculation in Varga's eyes that went beyond simple arithmetic. The children you speak of were sold 3 weeks ago, Varga said finally, to a cattle baron in Sonora who needed workers for his ranch. They're probably in Mexico by now if they survived the journey. Charlie felt her heart sink, even as she maintained her poker face. She'd known the chances of finding Timothy and Sarah here were slim, but hearing confirmation of their fate still hit like a physical blow. 2 innocent children, lost in a system that treated human beings as disposable commodities. Then I've wasted my time, Charlie said, starting to rise from her chair. Not so fast, Chica, Varga said, his voice taking on a harder edge. You may have come here for the children, but that doesn't explain how you knew to find me in these mountains. This location is not exactly common knowledge. Charlie realized too late that she'd walked into a carefully laid trap. Varga had known she was coming, had been waiting for her with questions prepared and suspicions already aroused. Somewhere in the compound, Steelhawk was moving through darkness toward the prisoner caves, unaware that their plan had been compromised from the beginning. That you see, Senorita Rivers. Varga continued, his voice now carrying the soft menace of a rattlesnake's warning. I have been expecting you for several days now. Ever since my scouts reported 2 riders following old Apache trails toward my mountains. One rider matching your description. The other, a man who moves like smoke and kills like lightning. Charlie's blood turned to ice as she realized the full extent of their tactical error. They'd been so focused on reaching the fortress undetected that they'd failed to consider Varga might have early warning systems in place. The Comanchero leader had let them approach, had allowed Charlie to walk into his compound, because it served his larger purpose. Where is he, Chica? Where is this Apache warrior who has been such a thorn in my side? I told you I don't know what. Varga's backhanded slap snapped Charlie's head to the side, the blow delivered with casual brutality that spoke of long practice in extracting information from unwilling subjects. Stars exploded across her vision as she tasted blood from her split lip. Please don't insult my intelligence, Varga said calmly, as if he hadn't just struck a bound woman. My men have been tracking you both for 2 days. We know you're working together, We know about the raids on my camps. We know you've been systematically destroying my operation." Charlie spat blood and raised her head to meet Varga's cold stare. "Then you know he's going to kill you all." "Actually, no." Varga replied with a smile that held no warmth. "Because right now my men are closing in on your Apache friend. The prisoner caves he's trying so hard to reach. They're empty, chica. I moved all the valuable merchandise to a more secure location yesterday." Horror flooded through Charlie as she understood the full scope of Varga's counter-ambush. Steelhawk was walking into a trap, risking his life to rescue prisoners who were no longer there, and she was powerless to warn him. "You used me as bait." "Honey, you used yourself as bait," Varga corrected. "I simply took advantage of your noble stupidity. Though I must admit, I'm curious to see how long this Apache warrior of yours will last against 20 of my best fighters." The betting pools are quite active. Outside the headquarters building, Charlie could hear men moving through the compound with military precision. Orders were being shouted, and Spanish weapons were being checked, and torches were being lit to illuminate the darkness where Steelhawk moved unseen. Or at least where he thought he moved unseen. But what Varga didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Steelhawk had sensed the trap long before entering the cave system. The tunnels had been too quiet, lacking the sounds of human habitation that should have echoed through stone corridors where prisoners were kept. More importantly, Steelhawk had spotted the scouts following them 2 days earlier. He'd simply allowed them to think they were unseen while he formulated his own counterplan. 20 of Varga's best fighters had positioned themselves throughout the cave network, turning natural passages into killing fields, where crossfire would shred any intruder foolish enough to enter. They waited in absolute silence, their breathing controlled and their weapons trained on predetermined fields of fire. These were professionals who'd hunted Apaches before and knew the patience required to trap such elusive prey. But Steelhawk was no ordinary Apache warrior. He'd entered the caves knowing they were empty, knowing he was walking into an ambush, knowing that Varga's men were waiting for him. What they didn't expect was that he'd brought company. 3 nights earlier, while Charlie slept, Steelhawk had ridden back along their trail and made contact with a band of Chiricahua Apaches led by his cousin Naiche. The warriors had been tracking the same Comanchero operation, seeking revenge for their own losses. When Steelhawk explained his plan, they'd agreed to help not for the white woman, but because Varga's organization had taken Apache children and sold them into slavery. Now, as Varga's men waited in the caves for Steelhawk to walk into their trap, they found themselves surrounded by 12 Apache warriors who moved through darkness like living shadows. The ambush became a slaughter conducted with the silent efficiency that had made the Apache the most feared fighters in the Southwest. Outside, the sound that Charlie heard wasn't gunfire from the caves. It was Steelhawk's carefully orchestrated deception. He'd rigged several of the dead Comancheros' rifles to fire when tripwires were disturbed, creating the impression of a running battle while his Apache allies eliminated the cave guards one by one. By the time Varga's remaining forces realized they were being systematically destroyed, it was too late. The fortress that had seemed impregnable just hours earlier was now a blazing ruin where decades of criminal enterprise were being reduced to ash and memory. Varga stood at his headquarters window, watching torch-bearing men race through his compound toward the caves, where gunfire continued to echo sporadically. His confident expression had evolved into something more thoughtful as reports filtered back from his field commanders. Patron called Miguel Torres, his lieutenant, bursting through the door with sweat-stained urgency. "We have a problem. The shooting from the caves has stopped, but we can't raise any of our men on the signal horns." "Define can't raise," Vargas said, though something cold was already forming in his stomach. "Dead silence, Jefe. 20 men went into those tunnels, and now it's like they never existed. No responses to calls, no movement on the perimeter, nothing." Varga felt the first whisper of doubt creep into his confidence. He'd planned this trap with meticulous care, using every advantage his position and numbers provided. But the Apache warrior was proving more formidable than even his reputation suggested. Charlie, still bound to her chair, but close enough to hear the conversation, felt fierce satisfaction bloom in her chest. Steelhawk was turning Varga's trap inside out, demonstrating why the Comanchero leader's predecessors had learned to fear Apache warriors who fought for causes larger than personal survival. "Send another 20 men," Varga ordered, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty. "And this time use the flamethrowers. Smoke him out if you have to." "Lamtron, with respect, maybe we should consider—" Torres never finished the suggestion. Steelhawk's rifle spoke from the darkness beyond the window, the bullet taking Varga's lieutenant through the head in a spray of blood and bone fragments. The Comanchero leader dove for cover as glass exploded inward, showering the room with glittering shards. "Impossible," Varga snarled, pressing himself against the wall beneath the shattered window. "He's trapped in the caves. How did he get outside?" Charlie could have told him that underestimating Steelhawk was like underestimating a thunderstorm. You might survive the experience, but the landscape would never be the same. The Apache warrior had obviously found a way out of the cave system, and now he was bringing the fight directly to Varga's doorstep. More gunfire erupted across the compound as Steelhawk and his Apache allies began systematically eliminating sentries and strongpoints with surgical precision. Each shot was carefully placed, each target chosen for maximum tactical impact. Guard towers fell silent as their occupants discovered that darkness was no protection against hunters who'd learned their craft in country where visibility meant survival. What followed was less a battle than a masterclass in asymmetric warfare. Steelhawk had spent months studying Varga's fortress, learning its weaknesses and blind spots, while posing as a loyal subordinate. Now that knowledge became a weapon more devastating than any rifle or blade. The compound's water supply came from a spring that fed into a central system through clay pipes buried beneath the courtyard. Steelhawk's first major action was to contaminate that supply with a concoction of desert plants that would cause violent illness within hours. By morning, any defenders who survived the initial assault would be too sick to fight effectively. The ammunition magazine occupied a reinforced bunker near the main gate, positioned to provide easy access during emergencies, but protected by thick walls and multiple sentries. Steelhawk approached the structure like smoke drifting across the desert, eliminating guards with silent efficiency before placing explosive charges that would render the entire facility useless. Varga's remaining forces found themselves fighting an enemy who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Sentries would report movement in the eastern sector, only to have their comrades in the west come under devastating fire. Supply caches would explode without warning, ammunition stores would go up in flames, and trusted positions would suddenly become death traps. "He's one man," Varga shouted at his remaining lieutenant's spittle flying from his lips as fear began to overcome rage. One Apache warrior against 40 fighters. How is he destroying us? But the truth was evident to anyone with eyes to see. Steelhawk wasn't fighting like one man, he was fighting like a force of nature given human purpose. Every Apache skill his people had developed over centuries of warfare was being brought to bear against enemies who'd grown comfortable with their numerical superiority. Charlie watched the systematic destruction of Varga's organization through the broken window, her heart racing with a mixture of terror and admiration. Steelhawk moved through the fortress like an avenging spirit, unstoppable and implacable in his pursuit of justice. This was what happened when someone pushed a warrior too far. The explosion that destroyed the ammunition bunker lit up the mountain night like artificial daylight, sending flames hundreds of feet into the air and raining burning debris across the entire compound. Secondary explosions followed as stored gunpowder and rifle cartridges cooked off in the intense heat, turning Varga's military advantage into a funeral pyre for his ambitions. "We have to evacuate," one of Varga's remaining men pleaded, blood streaming from cuts inflicted by flying glass. "The whole place is coming apart." But Varga was beyond rational thought, now consumed by rage that his perfect trap had become his own destruction. He turned toward Charlie with eyes that held nothing human, drawing a silver-plated revolver that had been taken from a murdered cavalry officer. "And you did this?" Varga snarled, pressing the gun's barrel against Charlie's temple with enough force to leave a circular bruise. "You and your Apache dog have destroyed everything I built here." Charlie felt the cold metal against her skin, but refused to show fear in front of this man who'd caused so much suffering. "Good," she said simply, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "The world will be better without your kind of business." Varga's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could fire, Steelhawk's voice cut through the smoke-filled air like a blade. "Step away from her, Varga." The Comanchero leader spun toward the sound, keeping his gun trained on Charlie's head. Steelhawk stood in the doorway, like death incarnate, his clothes torn and bloody, but his eyes burning with implacable purpose. Behind him, the fortress continued to burn as his campaign of destruction reached its inevitable conclusion. The famous Steelhawk. Varga sneered, though sweat beaded on his forehead despite the mountain cold. "Come to rescue your woman like some knight in a children's story. Come to finish what you started when you decided to trade in human lives." Steelhawk replied, stepping slowly into the room. His hands hung loose at his sides, but Charlie could see the coiled tension in every line of his body. "One more step and I blow her brains across the wall." Varga warned, his voice cracking slightly under the strain. "Is that what you want? Is your revenge worth her life?" Steelhawk stopped moving, but his gaze never wavered from Varga's face. "This isn't about revenge. This is about justice. And justice doesn't negotiate with slavers." The standoff stretched taut between them, like a wire ready to snap. Charlie could feel Varga's desperation in the way his gun hand trembled slightly, could sense Steelhawk calculating angles and distances with predatory precision. Someone was going to die in the next few seconds. "You know what your problem is, Apache," Varga said, trying to inject confidence into his voice. "You think like a warrior when you should think like a businessman. Everything can be negotiated if the price is right." "Some things aren't for sale," Steelhawk replied quietly. That's when Charlie made her move. She'd been working at the ropes, binding her wrists throughout the entire confrontation, using techniques Steelhawk had taught her during their journey through the desert. When Varga's attention focused entirely on Steelhawk, Charlie twisted her left hand free and grabbed the Comanchero leader's gun arm. The struggle for control of the weapon lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours to Charlie as she fought with desperate strength against a man whose survival depended on maintaining his advantage. Varga was stronger, but surprise and desperation gave Charlie leverage that raw power couldn't overcome. Steelhawk moved the instant Charlie grabbed Varga's gun arm, crossing the room in 3 fluid strides. His knife found the space between Varga's ribs with surgical precision, angled upward to pierce the heart and end the Comanchero leader's reign of terror forever. Joaquin Varga died as he had lived violently, surrounded by the wreckage of his own ambitions. His body collapsed to the floor of his burning headquarters, blood pooling beneath him, while flames from the destroyed ammunition bunker cast dancing shadows on the walls. Steelhawk cut Charlie's remaining bonds with efficient strokes of his blade, then helped her to her feet as explosions continued to rock the fortress around them. The compound that had seemed so impregnable just hours earlier was now a blazing ruin where 40 years of criminal enterprise was being reduced to ash and memory. The prisoners. Charlie asked, her first thought going to the innocent victims who'd brought them to this place. "Where are they?" 3 miles south in a hidden canyon Varga used as a backup facility. Steelhawk replied, supporting Charlie as they made their way through smoke-filled corridors toward the exit. "I found the location in his papers while you were keeping him distracted." They emerged from the headquarters building to find the entire fortress in flames, abandoned by the few defenders who'd survived Steelhawk's methodical assault. The Comanchero organization that had terrorized the frontier for decades was dying in a single night of violence that would echo through criminal networks from Colorado to Mexico. As they rode away from the burning stronghold, Charlie looked back at the column of smoke rising into the star-filled sky. Somewhere in those flames lay the bodies of men who'd built fortunes on human misery, their ill-gotten wealth reduced to worthless ash. It wasn't complete justice. Too many victims could never be brought back. Too many families would never be whole again. But it was a beginning. The rescue of the remaining prisoners took place at dawn, when Steelhawk and Charlie arrived at the hidden canyon to find 23 women and children chained in conditions that would have shamed the operators of a dog pound. Among them were faces Charlie recognized from other wagon trains, other auctions, other scenes of tragedy that connected the frontier's scattered settlements in a web of shared suffering. But Timothy and Sarah Mullins were not among the survivors. Their trail had gone cold in the markets of Mexico, where American law held no sway, and Apache warriors were just another commodity to be bought and sold. Charlie felt their absence like a physical wound, but she also understood that their memory would drive her forward into whatever battles lay ahead. 6 months later, the name Steelhawk had become legend throughout the Southwest. Territorial newspapers carried stories of the Apache warrior who'd single-handedly destroyed the Varga organization, while Mexican authorities posted increasingly large rewards for information leading to his capture. But the man himself had vanished into the desert, like smoke, leaving only rumors and empty slave camps in his wake. Charlie Rivers had also disappeared from official records, though reports occasionally surfaced of a red-haired woman riding with various Apache bands, teaching children to read while learning the ancient arts of desert warfare. Some said she'd become Steelhawk's woman. Others claimed she was training to become a warrior herself. The truth, as usual, was more complex than the legends. They worked together when their paths crossed, hunting slavers and rescuing victims with the efficiency of a machine designed for justice. But both understood that their partnership was built on shared purpose rather than personal attachment. Charlie had her own demons to hunt, her own skills to master, her own definition of justice to pursue. The auction yard in Tombstone stood empty now, its platform rotting in the desert sun while weeds grew through the boards, where so much human misery had been bought and sold. Jeremiah Pike had fled to California after Steelhawk's reputation reached his ears, taking his money, but leaving his conscience behind in the Arizona dust. Sometimes on quiet nights when the wind blew just right, old-timers claimed they could still hear the echo of that slap, the sound that had started everything the moment when one drunken outlaw's cruelty had awakened something in the desert that would never sleep again. They said Steelhawk was still out there, still hunting, still delivering the kind of justice the territorial courts were too weak or corrupt to provide. And in the hidden places where evil men gathered to trade in human lives, they whispered warnings about the Apache warrior and his red-haired partner. They spoke of justice that came like lightning in the night of slavers found dead in their beds, with Apache arrows through their hearts of auctions that never took place, because the auctioneers had simply vanished. The frontier was changing slowly, but inevitably. Railroads were bringing civilization to the wilderness, territorial governments were growing stronger, and the casual brutality that had once characterized the Southwest was giving way to something approaching law and order. But in the spaces between settlements in the canyons and desert places where maps showed only emptiness, the old justice still ruled. And Steelhawk was its most faithful servant, a ghost in the machine of progress who ensured that some crimes would never go unpunished, no matter how far their perpetrators ran or how well they thought they'd hidden their sins. Charlie Rivers rode beside him when duty called, but she'd also begun building something new. Schools for Apache children, safe houses for escaped slaves, networks of information that helped identify slave traders before they could strike. She'd learned that justice wasn't just about punishment, but about prevention. Not just about destroying evil, but about building something better in its place. Together, they'd written their names across the frontier in blood and fire, creating legends that would outlast their mortal lives and inspire future generations to stand against injustice, wherever it raised its head. They'd proven that sometimes, when law failed and civilization turned its back on the innocent individual, conscience could still make a difference. The story that began with a slap in a dusty auction yard had become an epic of redemption, justice, and the unbreakable human spirit that refuses to accept evil as inevitable. And in the end, that refusal had been enough to change the world. One rescued victim and one dead slaver at a time. On a spring morning in 1888, exactly 1 year after the destruction of Varga's stronghold, Charlie stood before a newly built schoolhouse in the mountains of southeastern Arizona. 12 Apache children sat on rough-hewn benches, their dark eyes bright with curiosity as she taught them to read from books purchased with bounty money taken from dead slavers. Through the open door, she could see Steelhawk working with a group of young warriors, teaching them the tracking skills that had made him legendary. But more importantly, he was teaching them restraint and the difference between justice and vengeance, between protecting the innocent and becoming the very evil they fought against. It wasn't the life Charlie had planned when she left Colorado to become a schoolteacher in Santa Fe. But it was the life she'd chosen, forged in the crucible of suffering and tempered by the understanding that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the cost. As the sun climbed higher into the desert sky, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Charlie Rivers smiled and continued her lesson. There were still monsters in the world, still victims who needed rescuing, still injustices that demanded correction. But there were also children learning to read, young warriors learning the difference between right and wrong, and two people who'd found their purpose in the endless fight between darkness and light. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.